So Mo, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I'm really glad to have you as my first guest.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell people watching a little bit about yourself and?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for inviting me to, share a bit of my view on mental health and my own personal story on the contemplations. My name is Maurice Yearwood. I recently finished my doctorate here at the University of Cambridge. One of my focuses is on well-being and mental health now. And I'm very interested to kind of share my story in regards to my background of being brought up and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I'm from America originally, been in the UK for a number of years. But initially being born and bred in Brooklyn, New York, I had the opportunity to compete at a very high level in basketball. And that led to great opportunities in terms of going to university, and then being able to take that same kind of competitive spirit and love for challenges into working in finance originally before I made the career transition to psychology and academia. And the reason that's very important is because being a competitive athlete and then having to deal with like a lot of health issues, which we'll then definitely go into, is why I decided to look into well-being more.
So I'd love if we could actually start with this. If you could tell us a little bit about what personally brought you to actually talk about mental health more in your work. Like what were the personal journeys you've been through?
Yeah, so in 2008 or 2009, I was diagnosed with trigeminal neuralgia. And trigeminal neuralgia is a nerve condition, also known as the suicide disease, which really impacts your sensations around your face. So anything you feel, your tongue, your lips, all of those sensations are actually supported by your trigeminal nerve. Now what happens is when your nerves start to connect in a way that acutes to pain, it then subsists without there being a need. So where if you like stubbed your toe on something, you would feel pain. But in this instance, my nerves were just sending that signal constantly throughout the day. So I was always in pain. And what that did for me was, being an athlete who was always healthy since I was young, it forced me to look at my health in a much different way. But the real thing that kicked in was, at the time I was working in finance, and I was trying to explain to my colleagues and to my manager that I was going through this immense pain and it was disrupting my work. But the reality was I still looked the same, right? You couldn't really see a big lump on my head or swollen eyes or physical attributes that show or signal to a society that you're sick or you're ill. I look the same way I look right now.
And how intense was that pain? Because
on a scale of 1 to 10,
yeah,
30.
30. Yeah,
it was the most incredible pain that I had ever gone through in my life, even up until this point. And I've had about 4 or 5 surgeries just from playing basketball and different activities. But trigeminal neuralgia always stands on top. And my friends, they would see me and they wouldn't think anything of it, but I had this immense pain on the left side of my face. I couldn't really think, headaches. And what that does is it made me realize, actually, there are a lot of people who are suffering with issues or health issues that other people necessarily can't see. And how do you deal with those circumstances and those situations? And it made me a bit more empathetic when someone said they weren't feeling well and I couldn't necessarily see it. I really understood what they were going through because I had the same experiences. Now that I think about it, I don't think most of my friends know I had trigeminal neuralgia. I think I told a select few who were near me to help support me through it.
Yeah.
But in terms of my wider coalition of friends and business associates, I don't really think I mentioned it. And I think that's one of the issues that exist.
Yeah.
Is that these that we need to not necessarily look at it as a complete negative in our lives, but an opportunity to create and have a broader conversation around different health issues, and specifically like mental health.
In your way to relate to these invisible struggles, essentially, how do you think we're a little bit broken in the way we relate to mental health? How did you roll with the challenge, the ambition versus the illness, because everyone around you couldn't see it. How did you manage that conflict within you, and how do you think this can be extrapolated to any of those invisible?
Yeah, I don't even, if I'm honest, I don't think I actually managed it well at all.
Right.
There was no, it put me in a position where I realized I have absolutely no control.
No, right.
I think the biggest thing for me was through all of the difficult times in managing that chronic illness, the thought process for me was not a sense of surrender, but a realization that, okay, this is my life, and becoming very comfortable with it being my life. So if you want to talk about managing, I think the first step for me was being aware of it. The second step was realizing that this is a part of me, and it doesn't necessarily make me weak. And then the third piece was, okay, well, how do I get through my day step by step with this illness? And if it does arise, how do I deal with it in terms of communicating with other people that I have this, which is also really interesting issue, I think, with mental illnesses or different things that exist.
So what's your feel about like changing that discourse, changing the way we talk about mental health?
I think in a broader context, one of the things that was really exciting for me in terms of making a career transition from finance to academia and psychology was looking into work motivation and also passion. And I think on a grander scale, where I kind of look at it now is not necessarily the severe mental health or mental illness issues that exist, but it's more so the fact that there are milder mental health issues.
Yes.
It's the anxiety and stress that is perpetual or consistent in people's lives. And I think when you're very ambitious, you don't pay attention to it. It just becomes part of life, that stress, that anxiety. And the issue is that then leads to physical issues and symptoms in your life. So a lot of times it's okay to, if you break your arm, society sees that as a signal, your manager at work sees that as a signal, and you can get some time off, you can do some physiotherapy on it, take 2 weeks and you can get back to work. When you have perpetual stress or a very severe mental health issue, we don't necessarily take the same time off to heal from that. And your question of how do we get around, I guess, looking at that a bit deeper or having it's starting to have a broader conversation around it and release certain stigmas that are attached to mental health. I'm keen on people being more open to discussing the issues that they deal with on a day in and day out basis. So on one side, for me, it's being able to show that this is important. Two, we need more diverse thinking in different fields of health or even in the social sciences, but also really just raising the awareness.
So, Maurice, I'd like to know a little bit more about what were the other harder blockers that are like even more untold than just a workplace environment, working in finance, and the pain being just not fitting within that context. But is there a broader context in which this creates?
I think the broader context is when you're dealing with mental health, which is extremely sensitive for certain communities. I can speak specifically from the African American community, and to a certain extent the wider Black community, is there are stigmas which are attached to raising your hand and saying, I have a mental health issue. To discuss severe depression, to discuss not even wanting to get out of bed, or even having like suicidal thoughts is very difficult for certain communities, I think, at this stage to be very accepting of that. So one of the biggest issues, that we see are people are actually holding on to their mental health issues and not being open about it with close family members, friends. A lot of times when people commit suicide, You know, I've had a few individuals in my life over the past couple of years where that's happened, and everyone always says the same thing. You know, this person was bubbly, they were amazing, they were loving, they were great, but there's something else happening on the inside. And a lot of times we have so much going on right now, you know, in terms of work, even managing social media accounts, managing our personal lives, relationships, children, finances. There's so many different things that are pulling at us at a given moment that it's taking that time to kind of step back and assess what's actually happening inside. So in terms of one thing I would love to see specifically within the African American / Black community is more conversations around issues that people are having with stress, anxiety. I think the more conversations that we and discourse that we have around this, it will, you know, kind of pull that stigma of being weak because you feel depressed. I'm really, really big on having more conversation around mental health within the African American community. It's something that's very important to me because I don't want the next generation and the generation after that to feel as though being vulnerable is not the right thing to do. I think there's a lot of power in vulnerability. And you have to keep in mind, there are a lot of individuals who are 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s who also clam up in terms of expressing oneself emotionally when things are really hitting home.
Yeah, there's no age at which emotional maturity is reached.
Yeah.
There's many things we know, like a 1-year-old child is going to start to walk, he's going to start talking a little bit later. We know that, but like reaching emotional maturity, it's much different across the board.
Yeah. And for me, it's very important. You know, it's important that mental health globally is something that we have more discourse around, but specifically close to heart for me, being a Black academic, being a Black psychologist, and really now moving more into being, you know, Black well-being practitioner, someone who's really invested in that. It's important that, you know, our brown and Black, you know, babies grow up not necessarily just feeling positive and great about themselves, because that's really a false reality. It's being able to, when life really starts to throw a lot at you, being able to not just say, I have the tools to, you know, do positive self-talk and law of attraction and all that, but being confident and comfortable and just being vulnerable. Let's not necessarily hold back and support the stigma around mental health. Let's start looking at it from a different perspective. And what that means is it's up to the generations now to begin talking about that.
Maurice, thank you so much for sharing.
Of course.
This was an amazing episode for me to partake in. I hope it added lots of value to you guys. And I guess we'll see you next week in another episode where we'll dive into a little bit more of that passion that Maurice studied, and he will tell us more about that experience in particular and how the back-end story was a little bit different than the initial goal of studying passion.